In this video, I was going to talk about the skills of the average player at a certain rating, and I was going to be going off of the Switch rating on Puyo Champions, and that does matter because the different platforms have a bit different levels to them. So on PS4, at least when I played on it a few years ago, it used to be a lot harder than the Switch version. So like if you could get 2700 on PS4, you could probably get like 2900 on Switch, somewhere around there. And then PC might be easier. I haven't played on PC that much, but when I was playing on it recently, it felt like it might be easier or it might be large variants. Like sometimes you could play different players at the same rating, but they could feel like their strengths, like their level was a lot different. So it's hard to say for PC. And then it might differ by time of day. So, like I said, especially on less popular platforms, because um, if it's less popular, you might end up playing the same people over and over a lot, and then that could skew things. Then, as time passes, so like a couple years from now, the levels might be a bit different too. And anyone can be good or bad at different things. Like they could have their own individual strengths and weaknesses. So even though like players at a certain skill rating tend to have certain strengths and weaknesses, that doesn't necessarily mean those will be your own individual strengths and weaknesses if you are at that rating. And I wanted to emphasize that there's no one way to be good. So if if you're not good at any of the strengths that I have listed, but you're able to maintain a certain rating, then that means you deserve to be that rating. Like you don't have to be good at the things that I have listed as strengths in order to deserve the rating. You just have to be able to consistently like maintain it. So to get into it, the first range I have, which is just like an arbitrary cutoff, and then at the edges it kind of goes into the next range. But if you're at 2100 to 2500, the strengths you can expect are, well, if you're able to be 2100 or higher, you can probably chain, which is a strength. And sometimes you can probably go fast, but mostly only on the first floor. And and a lot of these players at this range can make like 10 chains or higher even in an actual match. But as for the weaknesses, what the things that prevent them from being even stronger is they often run into confusing situations. So it'll just be like a piece that they have no idea where to place. And when that happens, they'll have to slow down a lot, or they'll make a bunch of small clears, or they'll throw away the piece. So they may be able to go fast, but they just have to put the piece somewhere where they can't use it. So usually you'll see one of those three things happen or more, and they'll happen pretty often for players at this level. And it's rare to see any kinds of attacks. So at most, usually the attacks that do happen tend to happen when the player is just cleaning up their field, like they're just getting rid of pieces that they don't know how to use, but they do see how to make a two chain with them while they're like cleaning them up. So those are usually the kinds of attacks you see. And then these players often struggle with garbage, so even if it's only like one line of garbage, they may not know how to dig through it efficiently, and they may like take a lot of time to get through that one line of garbage, and then that can really hurt them in the round. And they also struggle with adjusting to the situation pretty often. So, um, what I mean by that is sometimes the opponent will be in a situation where they have some garbage on their field and then they can't really do much, and you could just follow up with a two chain or a three chain to guaranteed win the round pretty much. But the player won't recognize that and they'll just go on building their own chain, and then they'll let the other player recover and maybe win the round. Or sometimes if the player just has to set off a main chain, they may not recognize that and they may try to extend a lot and then lose the round as a result. So those are some of the weaknesses, and a lot of that is because the players tend to build very rigid chains that are almost like the exact same every time, but because the pieces are random, it's not possible to build the same chain every time. So that's why they'll run into confusing situations where they're trying to build a single type of chain over and over, but the random piece sequence isn't letting them build the chain that they want to build, and they don't know how to adjust. So at this level, that's what you'll see a lot. Now, if you go one level up, so 2500 to 2700 is the arbitrary range I picked. The strengths of players at that range are going to be they generally are able to go fast on the first floor, whereas in the lower range, they could go fast on the first floor sometimes, but a lot of times they were going to run into something confusing and slow down. So at this range, they're generally fast on the first floor, and they go for mid-game attacks a bit more often, and they go for intentional attacks sometimes, and sometimes they're able to build pretty efficiently. Like they can maybe make 11 or 12 chains, and again, sometimes they can go pretty fast while they're doing it. But as for the weaknesses, they still have limited chain knowledge, so that may cause them to miss things that a stronger player would find. So they may miss alternate ways of starting a chain, where if all you have to do is set off your chain, they may miss that you could start it with a different color, or they may miss certain tail extensions where you might just need one color to add an extra link in the tail, but they may not see it, and things like that. And then they tend to make mistakes under pressure, so if they're under pressure to set off their main chain, they may um, make accidental clears that make it so that they can't set it off, or they may forget to put a certain color somewhere, and then that causes the chain not to connect, or they may make cuts that a stronger player can see more often. And even at a higher level, you can still make mistakes under pressure. It's just that at this rate range, players more often make mistakes like that when they're under pressure. And they tend to be inconsistent in how well they build and how quickly they can build. So, again, sometimes they can build really fast, and sometimes they can build really efficiently, but sometimes they can't. Like if they get a sequence that they really don't know how to deal with, then they might be pretty slow and they may not be able to make an efficient build. So they might have more options and a little bit more consistency than the players in the 2100 to 2500 range, but they'll still run into the sequences that they don't know how to deal with very well. And then again, cuts and missing Puyo is also a problem that you'll see pretty often. Now to go one more level up, so 2700 to 2900 is the range I picked. The strengths you'll see is improved build consistency and first floor speed, so they'll be a bit more consistent than the 2500 to 2700 level players, and they'll be pretty consistently fast on the first floor. And again, the lower level players can be fast on the first floor, but they just aren't always fast. They'll run into situations where they don't know what to do, really. And then you'll see even more intentional attacks at this level, where the players will build to make an attack like a 2-chain or a 3-chain and then send it. And then because they're doing that, they'll also have something there where they might be able to make a counter. So they may be going for a 2 or a 3-chain, and then the opponent sends a 2-chain. So then they just have a 3-chain counter there and they can make a counter. And then players at this level can often make pretty big chains, like they can hit 12 chains in a match and maybe even higher. But as for the weaknesses, they often slow down on the second floor, so they can be pretty consistently fast on the first floor, but then slow down on the second floor. And then the attacks are often either all in because they'll just like destroy too many Puyo or too much of the build, So it'll be an all-in attack, and if the opponent can send their main chain, then they're probably going to lose. Or it'll be a weak attack, like a really small 2-chain or a really small 3-chain, which tends to be inefficient and can be risky at times. Then the players tend to have limited awareness, so they won't really see if the opponent is doing something crazy or like about to send a big attack. They probably won't notice. And then if they have to read like what the opponent's setting off or how long the chain is, it'll take a noticeable amount of time. Like you'll see them slow down and stop moving the pieces or stop placing the pieces quickly as they look over to figure out, okay, what's my opponent doing? What are they sending to me and how big is it? And then they often make poor extensions under pressure where they may be able to find a way to extend, but it may not be very good and it may not be a very high chance of like completing, and they may miss certain like easier ways to extend the chain or use a certain part of the chain or a part of the field that has Puyo already. So now if you go to 2900 to 3100 level, what you're going to see a lot is a higher quality attacking game. So I would consider the tendency of players in this range is to be very strong attacking players. And so you'll see a lot of big 2 doubles or things like that, maybe big 3 chains and sometimes big 1 chains. So by higher quality, I mean you see a lot of strong and fast attacks where if it if you send a really small 2-chain, once you get to this level, the players aren't going to have trouble dealing with the garbage from that usually if it's in the mid game. And so it's not going to be very effective most of the time. Like it can sometimes work out, but most of the time you're just kind of like using up your own resources and putting yourself at a disadvantage, even if you connect. If you do an attack that's like really small, or if you do like a 3-chain that's really small, even if it connects, the opponent may be able to build a way to dig, and you're also giving them a lot of time to make a much bigger attack or counter, and then that can cause you to just lose the round outright. So a high quality attacking game would be making really big attacks that resolve really quickly, so it doesn't give the opponent a lot of time to react to them, and then if they don't react to them, they're probably going to lose. And then, so players at this level tend to play a much higher quality attacking game, and then they can sometimes read the opponent and then adjust what they're doing. So they do usually have the ability to build a big attack, but if they don't send it, they could convert it into a main chain a lot of times. And then you'll see even more counters because when you're building to attack, if the opponent attacks first, you can react to that and then just extend your attack maybe by 1 link or add a little bit more to it, and then now you have a counter. So because these players often play pretty aggressive and build their own attacks, they're also ready to counter a lot of times. And then at this level, the players are usually fast until they hit the second transition about. Then they'll tend to slow down quite a bit. But up till then, they can usually play really fast. Now, as for weaknesses of players at this level, you'll see suboptimal extensions where they might be slightly better than players at a lower level, but they still aren't. They might miss a certain line that they could take that would be a lot more efficient or have a lot higher chance of completing. Then you'll see a good amount of misreads, so the players may not be able to tell if what the size is of the opponent's attack very quickly, or they may not notice a cut in the opponent's chain. And this will happen at lower levels too, but this is also something that happens for players at this level. And you'll see inconsistent second chains where sometimes they'll be able to build a second chain, but sometimes they just won't be able to make a second chain with what they have on their field. And there's times where, you might win the round if you can make a good second chain, but players at this level can't do it consistently and will sometimes lose rounds that they could have won as a result. And then you'll see slow decision making speed a lot of times if they're making a read based on what the opponent is doing. So they'll slow down to see, like, okay, is my opponent doing this or is my opponent doing this? And they won't be able to like play at full speed while they're doing that. Or, they may be able to counter, but they have to look and see, okay, is my opponent sending an attack? And they'll slow down and then do the counter. And then the other side of that is they may be able to play really fast and make really fast decisions, but they probably won't be able to do that based off of reading what the opponent is doing. So it tends to either be they read what the opponent is doing, but that causes them to slow down, or they make a really fast decision, but they do it without reading what the opponent is doing at all. Sometimes just by feel, they just think, okay, if they're sending something now, it's probably a 2-double, so I'm going to send like a 4-chain without even reading. So they make a fast decision, but they don't actually read what the opponent was doing. Now, if you go to 3100 to 3300, this is a very high level. Like, I would consider myself to be about 3100 on average at my best, and I'm not sure if I'm at my best currently, so I might be lower than that, but I feel like at my best I was 3100 average, and then there's a lot of variance, so I could go like plus or minus 100 or maybe even plus or minus 150, but the highest I ever got to was like 3230, and it didn't feel like I had much potential to go much higher than that, just because players at that level were so strong and so consistent that I would just had to get really lucky to beat them pretty much. It was hard to really, like, I wasn't at the level where I could say I was better than them, so I would have to get lucky to beat them. Now, at this level, what you see is really quality extensions a lot of times. So even if the player has to extend a lot, they'll be able to find a good line that has a high probability of completing, or they'll like be able to give themselves a really good chance of finishing their extension and getting their chain off. And a lot of times that involves finding like a complicated idea or an unnatural idea in order to give yourself the best chance of completing your extension and making the most links that you can in the time you have. And then you'll see better counter consistency. So once you start getting to like 3200 range, then I think you'll see more of a shift towards defensive play, and that's because players at this level tend to be better at building counters consistently. So if you're attacking a lot, you're just kind of like attacking yourself into a disadvantage when it gets countered. So you'll see a lot more consistent quality counters at this level. You'll see faster decision making even while reading the opponent. So one level down, the players might be able to read the opponent, but they usually slow down when they do it. Or they might make fast decisions again without reading, but once you get to this level, they start to make fast decisions even while reading the opponent at the same time. Then you'll see more decisions made based on reads as a result because the players are able to read the opponent and do so very quickly. Then you'll see higher second chain consistency as well, so they'll build second chains that are a lot more efficient and they'll get them off a lot more than players at a lower level. Now, as for weaknesses, this is already so high up, so there aren't that many serious weaknesses for players at this level, but what tends to prevent them from getting even higher is that they may lose efficiency in certain complex situations. So if you have to attack and defend a lot, so if you send an attack and it gets countered, but you counter the counter, and then the round goes on, and then you attack again, and then the opponent counters, and now you have to send your main chain. After all of that, like back and forth, then players at this level might not be able to maintain like full efficiency, so there may be a lot of Puyo that they aren't able to use after like going through a bunch of attacking and countering. And then they may struggle in the complicated mid and late game exchanges where it's like in the late game, just one chain can send enough garbage to like cause the opponent to fill up or put them in a situation where they can't clear anything and they fill up. But if you know the opponent's sending a one chain, it's better to send a two chain, and then you like put the person who sent a one chain in that situation where they might just take a line of garbage and fill up. And if the opponent is sending a two chain in the late game, then you would want to send a three chain. But that's really difficult to like distinguish like what should you send, and it's really hard to figure that out while playing at full speed. So in some of those mid and late game like complicated exchanges, players at this level won't be able to keep up with the higher level players. So at the top class, what I'm saying is like 3,300 plus. If you're able to maintain this level of play, you're probably like a top Japanese pro or a very high level, like close to pro class if you can play at this level. What separates these players from all the other players is things like they have very high chain quality and speed all the way through to like 14 chain. So they can like maintain full speed all the way up to the top of the field pretty much and do so while building chains that essentially clear almost everything all the time without so they don't have to slow down and they can maintain their efficiency. And they can maintain that efficiency in almost all situations. So even if they have to attack and counter a lot back and forth, they can still find a way to pretty much clear everything that they place if they have to send a full chain. Then they can do this because they can find a lot of the complicated ideas when they're extending or attacking or countering. So that may be like setting off your chain in a different way or extending in a different way. So if you're not getting a certain color, they may still be able to find a different way to like build an attack or a counter anyway. So then that helps deal with the randomness and not getting the colors you need. Then they have very high consistency in second and third chains. So because the players at this level tend to be so consistent in building second chains, you even see third chains come up because, you know, you're like very likely to see a second chain from both players. So then when they both send second chains, then you get to the third chain, and you'll see very strong, like quality, fast decisions in the late game where even other like strong players, but one class down, might have to slow down to make a good decision, or they might make a fast decision that's not based on the opponent. So a lot of times at this level, the players can even make good decisions based on what the opponent is doing, even when you get to the top of the field. And you'll see some advanced mid-game strategies. So the main idea is that uh, if you send an attack and it gets countered, you're at a disadvantage. But players at this level can do complicated ideas like you send a small attack and it might get countered, but you counter the counter and you're still at an advantage somehow. So there's like complicated ideas like that involving multiple attacks or like successive attacks that can uh, change the idea of just sending like one attack and then one counter to the attack, and then the person who attacked is at a disadvantage. So, in summary, one of the maybe surprising things is that I feel like the big thing is consistency. You know, there's a consistency of like, do you always play your best? But that's not what I mean. Like, I would say most people tend to not always play their best, and most people tend to be a bit inconsistent. But if you're a high level player, you tend to be consistent overall piece sequences. So you don't run into piece sequences where you're like, I don't know what to do with this sequence. I'm not getting the colors I need to build what I want. You just know enough ways to build things that even if you're not able to build a certain thing you were planning on building, you can find a different way to build something else that does the same thing. So, so one of the interesting things I found was that it really does feel like lower level players can play like the players in a higher tier, but they can only do it sometimes. So they can actually play as good of a round as like a much higher level player can play, but they can only do it like every now and then, occasionally. And then a lot of the reason for that is just, the amount of chain knowledge you have. So if you get all the get like pieces that you always know where to put them, like all the pieces you want that go exactly with what you're trying to build, then you can probably play that sequence really well. But if you're at a lower level, you'll more often run into sequences that don't work with what you're trying to build, and that will cause you to either slow down or be less efficient, and then you're not able to play at that same level. So it really felt like when I was looking at different players, it felt like that one of the big differences was just that consistency and knowing how to handle whatever the game threw at you. And like I was saying, it requires deeper chain knowledge, so you have to know a lot of different ways to build a chain or extend in a certain area because you're not always going to get the colors you want, so you have to figure out a way to build something with the colors you're actually getting. And then it's not just knowledge, a lot of it is building up the ability as well. So, for example, looking at the next piece and then like planning where to put that while you're putting the current piece is a skill that you have to build up. And being able to watch the opponent and make decisions while also making decisions about where you're going to place your own pieces, that's an ability as well. And just like reading how big something is going to be if something gets cleared, that's an ability as well. So it's not just like knowing ways to build chains, you also have to build abilities. And then whatever you learn, whatever new things you learn, you also have to like train them and master them so that you can do them at full speed. So even if you learn a lot of different ways to build chains, if you can't execute them at nearly full speed in an actual match, then it's not really that useful. So like you'd probably even be better off just doing the same thing and not like doing new things if you can't do the new things at full speed. But to get to a higher level, you have to also be able to do those, learn new things, and then do them at full speed. So if it sounds really difficult, that's because it is really difficult, and it's it's like I guess I expected it to be really hard, and it was harder than I expected it to be, but kind of like that. So if you're trying to get good and you feel like you play a lot and you never really get better, that's a normal thing. It's not like a problem with you. It's not like you're not talented enough or anything. It's just that's a normal thing. It's just really difficult. And I'm not saying that no one can be really talented at it. So there's always the chance that maybe you can get good really fast. And some people kind of do. But for the most part, like most people tend to find it really hard to even get a little bit better. So so it's really difficult, but that's all for this video.